Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the first Tech to Market showcase, our panel discussion. Today will be on successfully pitching your technology, how to explain your technology to investors. I'd like to introduce our moderator for this panel, John Papa. He's the Executive of Communications at Booz Allen Hamilton, and he works on a lot of the coaching and training sessions for ARPA-E, as well as other government agencies. And I'd also like to just highlight before we get into the program that we will also be having a sign-up sheet going around where awardees can sign up for a pitch training and feedback, and that will take place in Chesapeake Room L after this panel. So, give it to you, John.
Great, thanks, Carl. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. We have a great session today with 4 distinguished panelists. We have actually 2 CEOs of small businesses that are both former ARPA-E performers and awardees, and we have 2 executives from venture capitalist firms. So we're looking forward to a very dynamic dialogue and want to address all your questions as well. So please feel free to send them in, text them in, email them in, and they'll be coming up on my iPad here, and I'll weave them into the dialogue as we go along. So first with introductions, I thought I'd give brief introductions to everyone and have them after that give a few remarks in terms of why they're here at the ARPA-E Summit and a little bit about their company. So first, starting to my left, I have Tom Stepien, the CEO of Primus Power. Primus Power was a former ARPA-E awardee. Next to him, I have Richard MacKellar, Managing Partner of Chrysalix Energy Venture Capital. Next to Richard, I have Frank Van Mierlo, CEO of 1366 Technologies. And at the end there, we have Keith Rosmah, who's the Director of Innovation at Vulcan Incorporated. An interesting tidbit is that Richard, right in the second chair, actually invested in Tom's company, and so you can get some advice in terms of how that dialogue went and what was successful with his pitch that led to the investment decision. So we'll start with Tom, just a brief overview of your role with Primus and why you're here today and what you're looking for.
Great, thank you. Happy Leap Day. So Primus Power is an energy storage company. We have very large batteries. These batteries are focused on grid applications. And as I'm sure if you haven't heard already today, you'll hear that that's a very important part of the energy ecosystem. We are 7 years old as a company. We have products on the grid. We were indeed an ARPA-E performer. I credit ARPA-E with helping us make some really important changes to our electrode in our battery that got us here and ideally will keep us here for the next Leap Day in 4 years.
Great, thank you. And Richard.
Richard MacKellar with Chrysalix Energy Venture Capital. We are a venture capital firm that focuses at the intersection of energy and the environment. So we are looking for technologies, we're looking for entrepreneurial teams that can really drive good breakthroughs in this area. Sounds like I'm coming in and out. So we're looking for breakthroughs in innovation, things that help and move energy forwards. What's going to be critical is that they have a very compelling value proposition.
Great, thanks, Richard. And Frank.
And our value proposition is that we make a silicon wafer for half the cost and 1/3 the energy. And silicon wafers is a $10 billion industry, rapidly growing. The silicon wafer is the most costly part of a solar panel. And solar is an industry that is going through huge transformations as it continues to grow. Costs keep coming down. Today, the cost of a solar plant in a good area and a well-executed facility is as low as 7 cents per kilowatt hour. That's very close to the cost of a new coal plant that is 6 cents per kilowatt hour. But if we continue on the learning curve that solar has been on, we're going to end up at 2 cents per kilowatt hour because we can do a lot of things like the sort of things that we are doing to the silicon wafer, the costliest component. It's slashing its cost by innovation and a much better manufacturing process.
Great, and one note on Frank's comment there, he's actually participating in best practice, which is he boiled down everything he did into one sentence that he led with. half the cost, third of the energy. Get right to the point, get right to the impact, and lead with the most important information. So it's very well done. You can tell you're a pro and have received lots of funding as a result. Keith.
I'm Keith Rosmah. I run the innovation group for Vulcan Incorporated. Vulcan is the investment arm of Paul Allen, Microsoft co-founder. My job is to find and identify technologies that so-called move the needle. Clean energy, clean environment technologies is one set of those.
Great, thank you. Well, to start off, I wanted to start with kind of a stage-setting question. I know all of you are executives in the energy space, either as CEOs or investors, and I wonder if you could lead with just some distinguishing characteristics of the energy space as a CEO or an investor versus some other industries, be it software or something of that nature. And just open to the panel, anyone who'd like to lead. Richard?
So I think some of the critical things that are different, before joining Chrysalix, I had the privilege of working for 3 startup companies, 2 of those as CEO. The critical thing in energy is the timeframes it takes you to get companies mature and to market is longer than it is in many other venture industries. The amount of capital that you need can be significantly higher. And then on the back end, certainly for a long period of time, although this has improved recently, the number of exits and the size of them has been more challenged. So if you've got challenging exits, longer times, more capital, that makes it tough to make returns, both as individual companies and as investors in the space.
Any other thoughts from others in the panel?
I don't know. For me, this is the second time I'm spinning a company out of MIT. I think, first of all...
Was the first one in the energy space as well?
There was a robotics company,
Okay.
which was very different. But, in both cases, building a company is always hard. And so the idea that somehow or another it's harder in energy, I'm not so sure that that is the case. I do think that we had an enormous boom where there was just such optimism that a whole bunch of people started companies that should have never gotten started. But a company that has a real value proposition, I think can deliver excellent return on money and can do that being reasonably capital efficient. So I actually think that this is a very exciting area. But of course I'm at the other side of the table.
Yes.
I guess I just add to what Richard said, that the current economic climate for energy is a very challenging one as well. Oil, as we all know, has dropped way down, and that makes things just a lot harder than they were even a few years ago. So something to keep your eye on. Now, if energy is a long-term play, then maybe you can hope it'll come back. But
And are there any, that's a good point that you raised, Keith, in terms of the current energy costs. Are there any tips that you would have from kind of describing the technology that some in the room may be developing in terms other than just reducing the cost, if it's in an area that's already low? Is it further reduction? Is it highlighting other aspects of it, the efficiency, the scalability, the cleanliness, et cetera?
Well, I think this comes down to something that I was going to say, eventually at some point in this, which is if you're making a pitch for an energy company, you should know who you're pitching to and who your investor is really well. They may be motivated by very different things. My particular motivation, I'm not allowed to lose money. I'm still supposed to make money, but I'm also supposed to make a difference in energy and climate, and I actually have a mission to do that. That makes me differently receptive than some other investors might be, and so that's a very important thing to know while pitching.
Great. You mentioned kind of knowing your audience, who the investors are, and probably I would say the number one tip in pitching from my perspective as a coach and a trainer is it's all about your audience. And interested in the panel's perspective, and particularly Tom and Frank having pitched and received funding, of things that you or your team might have done to research the investors, to prepare for the pitch, and to really tailor your approach to your audience.
Yeah, probably like many things in life, preparation is key. Certainly before we talk to Chrysalix and before talking to other investors, you want to find out, have they invested in this space? Have they invested in other companies, competitors to what you are pitching? Are they new in their fund cycle? Richard, I think, can tell you more about that, but it's typically a 10-year fund cycle, and there's probably more degrees of freedom at the beginning of that fund, year 1, 2, than there would be at year 8, 9, for example. So understanding that's a little bit trickier to find out. Certainly are good things. And then, if you can, of course, the individual that you're pitching to, right? If he or she happens to have the domain expertise in what you're pitching, that's great. You can do some homework there. If it's not the case, then you find yourself probably mapping and explaining things. So, like I say, with many things in life, prep is key, and it certainly makes sense to take. It's all very easy to do, of course. Take some time before you walk into that first session.
Great. Frank, anything from your perspective to add in terms of preparation?
So we started with an A round where in the period of 3 months we raised $12 million with 20 PowerPoint slides. And so you could say, whoa, wow, that sounds pretty impressive, and let's now focus on how to make the PowerPoint slides. But that would truly be not seeing the forest from the trees. Because the reason that was possible is because we had assembled a team that had a really strong track record. For me, it was the second time I was starting a company out of MIT. The first time we had earned money for the investors. The team that we had assembled had really strong academic credentials, had really strong industry credentials. And then we had great introductions with the people who had ended up funding us. So in the end, there were no shortcuts, right? I mean, that's maybe the hardest message I have is that, it is a little bit like the 12-year-old kid that comes up to the Joe Ma and says, boy, I want to learn how to play music. And the answer is, if you for the next 20 years study 6 days a week, 8 hours a day, you'll get better. And it's the long preparation, right, that gets you to that point. I mean, it's not there. I don't think there's really sort of quick gimmicks and shortcuts that can get you there.
You mentioned, Frank, the importance of the team in terms of the credentials and the experience and the knowledge they possess. Interested on the other side, the venture capitalist side, with Richard and Keith, it's commonly said that investors invest in people first and then ideas and technology second. How true is that, number one? And two, what things do you look for in entrepreneurs in terms of making or informing your investment decisions?
So clearly a team is very important. I teach in the MBA program at the University of British Columbia, and we talk a lot about what entrepreneurial finance is about and the combination of the 4 things you need, and all 4 of them are important. And we have a debate as to which is more important. Is it the market? Is it the product you're delivering? Is it that team? Or is it the finance that's going to make this all come together and happen? And it's interesting that when you read different venture capitalist philosophies, they fall into the different camps. And the counter-argument to team is critical. There's no doubt that team is critical. Team will make or break it. But unless there's some fundamental value proposition there, you're not going to make it either. So it's not sufficient to have team. And some venture capitalists will say, well, I can always replace the team, but I can't replace a lousy value proposition. So team is critical, but it's also quite valid where we've looked at companies where the team may not be complete, and we'll say we will make the investment, but we will have the discussion that there will be a transition of the management team. And be prepared for that discussion when you get into a VC discussion, because as we look at almost every investment we make, we want to have that discussion up front, so that if the day comes where that transition is necessary, it's not going to come as a surprise.
Great. Keith, would you like to add on?
Yeah, I think this plays into what Frank was saying also. Team is absolutely important. There's no question about that. Ultimately, my job is to invest in a company and help deliver it to profitability eventually somewhere down the road as efficiently as possible and with as least risk as possible. And the team is a key part of that risk. Showing that you have the whole deck together is part of that risk. This is the forest for the trees problem. Something I see a lot. I can see your 10-slide deck or your 12-slide deck, and every slide is pretty and nice, but they don't fit together and tell me that the entrepreneur or the company has really thought through the whole problem. And so, if you show me that you have a team, and that team is focused on dealing with the risks that the company is likely to face, and maybe there are some holes and they're going to get filled or changed, fine. But it all has to fit together in a piece that helps me understand what the full risks are facing the company and how they're going to be dealt with.
Great. Several of you referenced kind of the importance of the team and the pitch itself. Interested in your experience either as a pitcher or a recipient of that. Some things that really stood out or you learned along the way, some best practices, if you will, some things that immediately have some individuals or teams or companies stand out from others apart from their individual, technology. Open it to the panel. Tom, do you want to start?
I've learned to bring a prototype with me, even before we had our battery, to bring in samples of our electrode, or we recently just 3D printed a battery and bring that into pitches because, like all companies, we're still looking for money. And that is both a good icebreaker, you pass it around, talk a little bit about it, how do you make it, oh, interesting, but also makes it more real. And certainly making it real and being really clear what you do and how you distinguish it from what others do is helpful. And I've found that prototypes are helpful. Allegedly, Nest, to their very first meeting, brought in a sample of their thermostat, but it was a styrofoam sample, just a round sample. And even a crude prototype like that, I think, can really help in terms of bringing home the message.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Other thoughts in terms of things that stood out on the pitch?
Well, first of all, most companies do not get funded by VCs, right? And so, if you're starting a company, and this current company I am running now for my financial investors is very much a VC company, but my last company was not. And so, if you're starting out and you're looking for money, you sort of have to ask yourself, am I part of that 90% of startups that really should never accept VC money, or am I part of that 10% that should invest VC money? And those are different categories, and you just need to be clear as to where you're at. I mean, we're talking a little bit about sort of the data for the industry, and you know more about that than I do, but the data I have seen is that VCs tend to make their money from their home runs. That's very different from private equity. Private equity, they tend to make their money sort of in the middle, where they get 3-4x return and they make most of their money there. And occasionally they knock it out of the park and occasionally they lose money, but it's all about execution. With VCs, they make all of their money in their home runs. And so if you know that, then if you don't have the potential to be a home run, you're just not the right prospect for a VC. And so that you just need to be aware of that. And
that's a very good point to pick up on, because when we look at an investment, we will say, how does it return $100 million to our fund or more? We're very happy to have it more and a lot more. Wow. But how does it return $100 million to our fund, given that we're going to invest? We do early stage, so we're going to invest, if you're lucky and you get through several rounds, 10, 15 million, one or two might go a little bit more. But you're only going to get sort of $300,000 to a couple of $1 million initially, and the rest of that is all being reserved for you demonstrating to us that you can execute and perform along the way. And you think about all the other investors coming in, the dilution you're going to go through, those sorts of things, and we want that return out of the pot at the end of the day.
So a follow-up question for you, Richard, on that in terms of indication, early on, just even at a pitch, are there certain things for you on the other side of the table that give those indications that they're going to perform?
So clearly we've talked about management team already, but one of the most frustrating things is when someone comes in and they don't do what Tom was talking about. So they don't engage in a dialogue. It becomes a one-way diatribe. And so there's no interaction that's happening. That's almost guaranteed to lead to failure. You want to encourage there to be a dialogue. The other is people who come in and they launch straight into the details of what they're doing, and you're sitting there. They know they've got to talk about market. That's what drives value. It's so important. They're talking all about that, and they haven't actually told us what they do. So you're sitting there for 20 minutes going, I have no idea what this company's done. And by the time you actually understand what they're doing, you've forgotten all that bit that was driving the value beforehand. So that, as we heard a moment ago, that sort of first 30 seconds where you've captured what you're doing in a very concise way, so I know the subject matter that we're talking about, is absolutely critical. you can then go and say, okay, I'm going to come back to tell you how cool we are later, but this is why we're doing it. And this is why the value proposition is so compelling. The number of people that do not understand their value proposition, or do not understand their product, or do not understand their market is quite incredible. And we'll have people tell you how billion-dollar market there is, and yet they're going to have a business model that's licensing, where when you calculate it out, their market for that licensing of that product is not anywhere close to $1 billion. So, you know.
Richard, I'm glad you mentioned the first 30 seconds. I'm a firm believer the first 30 seconds of any speech, pitch, presentation is the most important part. For those of you who attend the coaching and training, that's really what we'll focus on, is that introduction, that hook, that engagement, that value proposition. Get it in early, get it in often, because that sets the stage for the entire dialogue to follow. I want to talk about, we talked about some best practices and some tips in terms of preparation, in terms of value proposition, in terms of pitch. What about common pitfalls, common mistakes, things that either you learned going through? I'm sure the two CEOs didn't bat 1,000, but mistakes, we all learned from them. What things did you learn? What would you do differently? What would you advise others in the audience? And the same thing for the VCs. What are some things that you see time and time again, people getting tripped up on and just not paying attention to?
I was just going to book in what they started in the beginning of the pitch and getting it all together. Don't forget to close. Don't forget to ask me for money. I know why you're here, right? Be surprised at how many people come in and
be all passengers
at the end of their talk, and you're like,
quads.
And they're timid about asking me for the money, or they don't know how much they want. They can't tell me what they're going to do with it. They can't tell me what their company is worth. They can't think about that part. Not only is that important for me, knowing that I can have that negotiation with them, it's a sign because that company has to sell to a whole bunch of other people. You can't be shy about closing your deal, and you should be firm with me and firm with everybody else and be able to execute on that. So you can have a great talk and then drop it all off at the end. Keep closing well.
That's a great point, Keith, on the importance of the close. Are there things in particular that you look for in that close when it comes to money? Is it you looking for an exact dollar figure, a range? What's your preference with regards to that?
I look for some logic about what they're going to do with that money and how they're going to spend it. I might not agree, right? You might ask me for too much or too little, and I'll say, well, no. But you should know what you want to do with your money. You say, look, I need 18 months to do this, and it's going to cost me this much to get there, and that's perfectly fine. I just want to know you got logic.
That's great. Yes, Richard.
And you've got to tell a plausible story on top of that says why this company is going to be worth a lot of money. It's no point telling me that it's going to be a $328 billion market. If I can just get 0.5% of that, I'm going to be massively rich. That doesn't work. What is the plausible method by which you're going to have a significant value?
Great. Yes, Tom, you want something to add?
Yeah, the one thing that we've learned, again, over the last 7 years as a company is to take really careful notes and then follow up. Oftentimes, a pitch isn't a one-time deal. Oftentimes, you'll hear, nice story, good company, come back when? We're a later stage investor. We want to see a prototype. We want to actually see revenue. We want to see profit, right? Those are typical milestones. So we've learned to take good notes, and then you follow up meetings and invitations next time with, we talked 17 months ago, and at that time we were too early. Here's what we've done in the process. That will make sure you get that second or third meeting. So it's a continuum, not just a one-shot deal.
So I'm glad you mentioned that, because I wanted to kind of drill down in terms of the time horizon for some in the audience that may be at different stages in their technology development. How long should they allot for to secure funding? Richard, you had referenced you have to go through several rounds of screening and before you actually get the actual funds. Tom, you mentioned sometimes it'd be premature and people want you to come back. Are there guidelines or guidance in terms of the duration for securing funding?
It could take a lot longer than you think. It sort of depends on the time of year. There are good times of year to raise money and bad times of year to raise money.
What are some of those good times?
Right now is a great time. winter, after Thanksgiving, it's very hard to get everybody lined up. Usually, but then the beginning of the year, people pick up, they have to get things done. What do you think, Richard? 6 months if you're a good company, and 12 months if it's taking you longer?
Yeah, I guess in many of our investments, it's been 6 months from the time we start talking to people to when we would close. And we've taken over a year. We've taken less than 6 months, but we'll take our time. One of the differences between being an entrepreneur and being on the investing side, there's a lot of advantage to speed of being an entrepreneur. There's very few advantages to speed of being an investor.
And to that note, are there anything that entrepreneurs can do to help increase the sense of urgency or that speed if they really need that funding in order to continue their idea or their company?
If you look at a straight rock wall, that's really difficult to climb. If you have two walls next to each other, you can chimney up, and that's actually pretty easy.
Maybe if you're the American Gladiator or American Ninja or something like that, I couldn't shimmy up two walls.
I have a personal anecdote. I love sailing, and I talk funny because I was born in the Netherlands. But I'm a U.S. citizen, proud of it, and the only reason I ever want to go to the Netherlands is to go there for vacation. I would not want to live there. But they have these flat-bottom steel boats, and the only way you can rent a flat-bottom steel boat is if you have experience on flat-bottom steel boats. And so, this is like, so how do you get through that? It's a lot like that with VCs. And so my solution to that problem was to rent two boats at the same time and give each other as reference. And that worked just fine. My A round wasn't all that different. We were trying to get this A round. First of all, when you're raising money for your A round, you should not be under time pressure. Unless you've really done something wrong. How can you possibly be under time pressure? Because this is your A round. So you don't have people yet, you don't have a big payroll yet, and so you presumably have all the time in the world. But are we moving to Mike?
Richard just needs a mic. Some of the lapels are not working.
Good. And in our case, we started talking. There was reasonably good interest. The hard work was in assembling the team and the credibility that came from that, and the hard work was in the track record that was formed in the 30 years that came before that, right? So that's actually the most important part. I don't believe in gimmicks myself, but still you need to close, and so we have all these interesting discussions, and then what we got is we got a term sheet from an industrial company that in the end, we never dealt with, but there was a very high-priced term sheet, and they were willing to step in at a very high valuation. And so once we had that in hand, we could call up the VCs that we actually wanted to work with, because it's much better to get money from a VC than from a strategic in your A round. Later that changes, by the way. But, and now there was this tension, and so it became easy to close. Otherwise, we would have been in that same process he's describing. Oh, we'll talk for a year. But you got to create that tension. Any deal, that's the case, by the way. Whether you're trying to date somebody on Friday evening or whatever you're doing, you need tension. If you don't have a credible threat, then yeah, sure, people will keep talking forever. And so creating that credible threat, creating a sense of competition, that will allow you to close.
That's good advice. Keith?
Notwithstanding what Frank says, and I definitely agree, you can't apply pressure that way, you can also get to know investors early before you actually ask them for money. I have lots of people who ask me for advice or come by and just say, hey, we're talking about putting this together. When people know you and there isn't that pressure, then they get a lot of information about you and how your company is and how you think, so that when you go make a pitch, they're much more better prepared to decide to act or not.
That's a great point. I'm glad you raised it, Keith. One of the things that's unique about ARPA-E from other government agencies is that awardees have to set aside a percentage of their funding for technology to market early on. I think it's 5%. And many times people don't know where to begin or how to begin. And so what are some ways that they could begin cultivating relationships with investors early on in the process? Tom, do you?
Some of it is looking at the list of folks who might be at conferences like this, that you're too early to talk to some of these guys here or other VCs or investors in the panel, but just wanted to use this opportunity to grab coffee, get some feedback on my thoughts, find out where their offices are, and the next time you happen to be in Vancouver, get on Richard's calendar, for example. So there's all kinds of ways in low keys, because Keith, you're absolutely right. The more you know these people, then they will come visit you next time they're in your neck of the woods. And that's a much better place to start.
Absolutely. Other thoughts or comments on that in terms of building relationships or cultivating those well before the pitch?
The one critical one then is making sure you get an introduction. We have what we call the transom deals. These are things that just get thrown in to info on our website. Those are far less likely to be looked at than where someone comes along who introduces you and says, hey, this is somebody I know. They're good people. Look at this great team they've got. I think it's a cool idea, but I'm not an expert in that field, but I really think you should talk to them. You're far more likely to get a discussion happening with that introduction than you are by just shooting an email to info@chrysalix.com.
That's great. With regards to the pitches themselves, from your perspective, is it more advantageous for people to be focused on their technology or on the market for their technology?
Go to
Keith?
both.
Is that a trick question? Market. I mean, the thing is, I love technology, right? I'm going to get the technology. I really like the technology, and so when I start asking questions about what the value proposition is or what the market is, that's because I'm concerned personally that my love of technology is going to carry me away, and I'm going to forget to think about that part. And you asked about mistakes earlier. When I ask someone what their value proposition is or what the market is, and then an entrepreneur comes back and tells me how cool the technology is, it's the wrong answer. So technology is great, but it's got to be economically viable. I think Dr. Williams said that this morning.
Others?
So I think of this as a sort of virtuous cycle, and if you get it right, you can build a great company. If you get it wrong, you'll build a terrible company. Or another way of thinking about it, startup companies are either spiraling up to success or they're spiraling down. And it's a very clear order in which these things happen. The market will drive the value. The value will allow you to raise that money. The money allows you to hire the people, and the people will allow you to build the product. The product then allows you to service the market. Sounds like I've lost this again. The product allows you to service the market. And what you're constantly doing is deliberately moving the bottleneck around the circle. So if you get it right, that bottleneck will move in very neat ways around that circle. If you get it wrong, you'll be fighting fires on three fronts. We were talking to one of our companies recently where they were fighting fires on three fronts, so we had to say, stop. Let's figure out which order you're going to put fires out and then how to get deliberately back into the cycle again. Now, technology people, they start by having this really cool idea, so they've started with the product, and they're trying to push that out there in the marketplace, and it's so much fun, and I'm so excited about it, and we all get enthused about it. But the problem is we've never really understood that, yeah, it's that market that's going to drive the value around that product. And I've said to some very smart professors, your technology is not worth anything. And that leads them to being very shocked because they believe it, if you build it, they will come. But in reality, it's only how that technology can service a market that leads to the value.
I think that's a really important point to emphasize, and it might sound like a common sense question to the panel, but it's probably the number one mistake that I see in working with a lot of entrepreneurs and ARPA-E performers. They make it all about the technology, and that's fine depending on your audience. If you're pitching ARPA-E in terms of the innovative technology, if you're talking with colleagues in terms of other researchers, et cetera, but when you're looking for money, for funding, for partnerships, you really need to focus on the market and lead with that, and then back it up with how your technology is going to exploit that market. I have a question coming back to describing what they do and the products that they do. There's some Harvard researchers Dan and Stan Heath that kind of coined the phrase the curse of knowledge. And it basically is that when somebody knows something so well, they have a really difficult time explaining it to others who don't have that background. And I know a lot of, many people here are in the energy space, but a lot of what these companies do is so specific and so niche in terms of the technologies or the sophistication. Do you have any tips, either as somebody delivering the message or receiving it, on how to really distill that and convey it in very clear and a concise and compelling manner?
There's a line from the movie Philadelphia where Denzel Washington says, "Explain it to me like I'm a 9-year-old." And that's a good place to start because you can always build on that. But certainly that's what I often think of. I also often think of an analogy that we are going to be something that everyone understands, right? And you can cast your product or service using that analogy because capturing and making sure the listener, understand what you're talking about so you don't get 20 minutes in the conversation, like Richard mentioned, and you got to get that out in the first 2 minutes.
Great. Other thoughts in terms of conveying things simplistically?
You know, I think if you start with the problem rather than the solution, you get a long ways. When you explain to people what a problem is, you know, energy doesn't flow across the grid right, or I can't charge my battery fast enough, and then you say, here's why, then it's a lot easier to turn around to the technology it takes to solve that. When you show up and explain, you know, the intricate chemistry of your electrode, it gets a lot harder to get people to what you're trying to do with it.
Mm-hmm. Great.
But if you
Yes.
if you worry about all of these things that people say you worry about, right? Okay, you need to have your elevator pitch. You need to have your PowerPoint slides. The font needs to be above 18. Audio, visual, and actual samples are good and stuff. And that all of that stuff is true, but that's 5%. 95% is content. That's what it is about. If you want to know how to raise money, it's not about those 5%. It is about what did you do to recruit the best possible team before you got any money? That's really your question, right? And so when you come to the A round with a team of 10 fantastic men and women who have a broad skill set and are all enthusiastic to join and they can all show up to a meeting, even though you don't have any money yet, well, that will be much more powerful than any gimmicks, right? So it is about content. Mm-hmm. There are no shortcuts. If I've learned anything, these shortcuts, you fall flat on your face anyway. Right. Because, okay, fine, you raise an A round. Well, pretty soon you need a B round. So, there needs to be substance. And probably the most important question is whether you should be looking for VC money at all. Because once again, 90% of the companies should not be doing that. It's only a small subset for which this makes any sense whatsoever. And by the way, VC money can be a real blessing if it's properly matched with the right company.
Great, thank you. Just a plug for the questions, if you could see up on the screen to text 22333 if anyone has any questions, they come up here and I'll be happy to ask them of the panel, so feel free to do that as we continue throughout. Interested in terms of, kind of what are some misperceptions about pitching, or what are some misperceptions about venture capitalists that you'd like to clarify? Common myths, different mispractices, misperceptions, that type of thing that these folks in the audience can avoid. Richard, you're smiling.
It reminds me of a joke about the venture capitalist. Oh, we've lost the sound again. It's coming and going. A joke about the venture capitalist with a glass eye, and when asked, well, how can you tell which one is the glass one? It's the one that shows empathy.
It's the one that shows empathy. I actually, I think VCs are much better in reality than their reputation. I think a lot of VCs turn down a lot of deals. And so there's a whole group of people who feel slighted, and so you got to sort of consider the source there. And my first company I bootstrapped, and so I owned that company, and I was completely in charge. So this company, my ownership is single digits, and I just simply worked for the guys who gave me money. And I had some real trepidations at first, thinking from, okay, right off the bat, I'm giving up control, and these guys are just interested in money. It's a bit scary. It turns out that, I certainly, and maybe I just got lucky, but certainly my VC directors have a lot of empathy. They really want to build a business. Their heart is in the right place. You have to perform. And for sure, at the end of every board meeting, there's an executive session, and the reason that exists is because they need to always have a space on the agenda to fire me. But at the end of the day, is they really don't want your job. And so you're much safer than you think.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. Thank you for saying that. I think a mistake that lots of people make is to think that they're just coming to your investor and they're going to give you money and you're going to go away, right? That there are only a couple ways that a venture investor can make money, right? One way is you can be better at picking risk than anybody else. And the statistics out there say that most investors are actually really bad at that, and you only get one shot at at the beginning of the investment anyway, so that's not good. The only other thing I can do to improve the quality of the investments that I'm making or anybody is that I can be involved in that company going forward, helping them overcome the risks that they're going to encounter and making them get to their goal quicker and better. That means I really don't want to turn over the team if I can possibly help it, and I don't want to make them do stupid things, and I want to introduce them to help, and I want to help them, if there's a gap in that company, I want to help fill that gap. It's my job to make that company go better, faster. And you get so many entrepreneurs who have an expectation that, look, just give me the money. It's like a grant. I'm going to go away and work on it, and I'll come back in a year and tell you how it's gone. And if you think that's what the relationship is, then I'm going to go find someone else to have a good business relationship with.
So Keith, you mentioned the importance of involvement, your involvement on the investor side. What is the level of your involvement, and does that change based on the amount of funding that you give, and how is that calibrated?
So Vulcan's a little different. We don't do a lot of deals, so we're pretty involved in companies that we invest in. As the amount of money comes up, a lot of Vulcan's investments, for other reasons, can also be syndicated, and in that case, we're probably not so invested. But certainly at the early stage, we spend a lot of time trying to help out, trying to accelerate things. There's a lot of fragileness in a company at the early stages, and if that company falls apart because I wasn't paying attention, that's on me.
And so when you say a lot of time, just want to drill down on that, what specific actions would you take or your organization take to be involved? Is it in board meetings, in executive decisions? Is it in hiring people? What market targets? Where exactly do you focus it on?
So sure, there's the board meetings. Sure, there's tell me who you're hiring because I'm going to go hit the network. And then there's also lots of industry navigation, I call it. So we have a company that is trying to deploy UAVs in various places around the world. And they had great technology, and they have a great company. But it was pretty clear to me that they had never actually deployed anywhere else around the world. And we have 3 other groups that deploy stuff around the world all the time. So we actually connected them up. We actually subsidized them, and doing that for a while, we connected them with other companies deploying around the world, and that opened a lot of doors for them.
That's great. Richard, what about your involvement?
Yeah, I was going to say it really depends on the state of the company. So an example, our company Glasspoint, which is now doing wonderfully well, we made the very first investment in them, and basically that funded their first prototype in California. So they're using solar to get oil out of the ground. So that company then, after we'd made that initial investment, we made the introduction to Shell. So we spent our time with our network, the oil companies, introducing them, helping them with that relationship, going to your old country, sitting in meetings, helping that along. And that was the early stage of the relationship that caused Shell to invest, that then led to one of their subsidiaries placing a large pilot order that then led to that subsidiary placing a $600 million order. Those are the sort of things you want to see happen. But as the company grows and matures and the management team becomes complete, then we don't need to spend nearly as long with them. They have a much more complete team. They have a much more complete board. their expertise in oil and gas then surpasses our expertise in that area, and they don't need as much time and attention. Where we can then still be useful is how do you connect them to the investment banks? How do you connect them to finding somebody with the qualifications that they're going to need when they need to do project finance? Those sorts of things are where we spend the time.
Great. And follow up for Frank and Tom on the other side. I know from working with entrepreneurs that many times they'll be hesitant to give up control, right? It's their baby, it's their child. They don't want to lose that. In both of your experience, was that a challenge for you? And were there benefits and or drawbacks to giving up some control of your company to investors or other third parties?
Yeah, I think we've all heard the saying that 0% of 100% is still zero. So, or 0% or 100% of a $0 billion company is still zero. So you need to think about the dilution and giving up control. When people say giving up control, it also often means dilution, right? That I want to have 20% of the company or whatever magic percentage you think you need to have. There is a balance, and that will change over time, and you need to think about what is the best outcome for everybody involved, especially if you're running the show. That is your job. You serve at the pleasure of the board. They can fire you in the last 5 minutes of the meeting if they want to. So I think that that's really important to get over that early, or maybe you should not be talking to VCs like our friend has possibly suggested.
Great. Frank, anything to add?
Well, you bring up another interesting point. So I have a fantastic board. I have the two VCs who did the A and the B round, and they have continued to invest in this, and they're currently part of the C round. And so they control the company. And then we have 4 independent directors, but one guy is a guy who did a silicon wafer company, which is sort of interesting because that's what we did, we are doing. And so he always tells me, he says, Frank, don't worry about percentage ownership. He said, the first time I got really rich is when I got single-digit ownership. And indeed, when his company, REC, went public, he only had 1% ownership, but he did an $8 billion IPO, so he came out okay. I think it's all about growing the business. I don't think you worry about ownership. I don't think you worry about control. In the end of the day, the big difference between this company and my last, where I was in charge, is that these VC guys pay me a lot more than I ever paid myself. I mean, they pay me like double. I would, if I had control of the company, I'd never pay myself that. So they're actually okay to deal with. But if they feel that you need to be replaced, maybe it's in your best interest to be replaced. I mean, there's no reason to get hung up about that.
Great. On the other side, with the investors, is there anything that you look for in terms of either trust, competence, or confidence in the entrepreneurs to kind of instill their leadership, their stability, and your comfort with them and their position and their decision making?
Well, we have a sort of way of thinking about decisions that some people say, well, all decisions should be legal. We have a threshold that is much higher than that. They need to be legal, they need to be ethical, and they need to be credible. So there's sort of 3 layers by which decisions need to be made. And it's quite often that people are not intentionally making decisions that are not credible, but when you peel them back, there are non-credible things that are happening. And most of those are in that unknown area of market. And they believe they can get their product out there, and all it needs is for those darn salespeople to sell it, and why can't they do it? And yet they haven't gone through the thinking cycle of the credibility of how you actually get out into the market and doing proper market discovery to get there. But if our entrepreneurs don't have that legal, ethical, credible level of making decisions, then the trust gets lost, and then it's very difficult to see eye to eye.
Great point.
Yeah, I'd say almost the same thing. We call it good judgment in our lingo, but it's pretty close to the same thing. It's that the person presenting to me appears to be clear-eyed and mature in their thought processes in how they think about how the whole package comes together, and that they're open and thoughtful about risks. Nobody can see that far into the future. You can call those out, and they have a thought process for how they're going to attack those risks or mitigate those risks. and they can say what they know and what they don't know, and they're really, self-honest about it and honest with everybody else. That's really easy to trust when you find someone who's like that. It's a very different thing when you find someone who presents and then starts hedging when you ask a question that they seem uncomfortable with.
Mm-hmm. You had mentioned, Keith, the notion of risk, and one risk is competition. And so one of the things I hear a lot is, well, there's no competition out there, there's no comparable product, mine's so unique. Could you enlighten us in terms of how investors or entrepreneurs should approach that? Should they introduce the competition, talk about how to mitigate that? Should they talk about how they're wedging in the marketplace and how they're better, either from a price, positioning, product, placement type thing?
You should be able to talk about the landscape. If you really think you're the only person doing this and there's nowhere near you, then you might want to ask why there isn't anybody else there. I think you should be able to speak. If there is significant competition near you, you should be able to say what it is and how you're going to approach it. And if there's some other kind of competition, right? If you're switching people from one thing to another, right? If you're Uber and you're telling them taxi cabs are out, or your personal car is out, right? It doesn't have to be head-to-head simple competition. It can be something about the landscape that you're changing. That makes a lot of sense, and you should absolutely talk about that.
Richard, anything to add on the notion of competition, whether to address it? Or Frank? Did you introduce a lot of, in your pitches, competitors and how you were different or similar products out there in the marketplace?
Well, we certainly, I spent a lot of time, I spend about a third of my time recruiting. I spend about a third of my time out with customers in the market. I've visited every single factory in the sort of top 15 in my industry. And then I spent the rest of my time fundraising. And so by the time I talk about the market, I visited any significant wafer plant in the world. I've just been there. So I can talk to that, yeah, for sure.
Excellent. Just another plug for the questions. We have about 10 minutes left in the panel. Also want to introduce Ray Long, who's, if you can stand up, Ray. He's in the middle there, and he has a sign-up sheet for those ARPA-E performers that are interested in pitch coaching and training this afternoon, and tomorrow. I think it's 3:30 to 6:30 this afternoon, and tomorrow from 11:30 to 6:30, and that'll be in the Chesapeake L room up on the second floor. I have a question for our small business executives, Frank and Tom. And ARPA-E awards are typically for 3 years or 36 months, and many times we see people at the end of that start to fret because they won't be able to continue their idea, their passion, their technology without the funding. Are there things, having gone through it and been ARPA-E performers and awardees, that you would recommend they do towards the end of their funding to prepare themselves for that next stage, whether it's VCs or what have you, partnerships, follow-on funding, other investment opportunities? Tom, do you want to start?
Yeah, so ARPA-E fills a very clear niche in the innovation cycle. I think we all know that. Don't wait till the end of that 24 or 36 months to then figure out, okay, what do I do next, right? As you start to think about how you can best use your ARPA-E funding, I would encourage you to focus on the minimal viable product, right? Maybe the product isn't something that can quite ship to a customer yet, but the product can work inside your walls, if you will. And if it's a product and it works, that is a very different discussion with funding potentials versus still at the idea stage. So that's a great way to try to use the back half of your ARPA-E timeline, is to really focus on that so you can start to have some of those discussions.
Great advice. Frank, anything in your experience to add?
Well, listen, the only way you're going to get financial investors to invest is if there's a real return on their investment. One way to significantly enhance their return on investment is to make sure that for every dollar in VC money you take, you try to get another dollar of non-dilutive money. And that's why these government grants are really important, as are industrial relationships. For us, we absolutely got government grants that were very important and supportive, but we also We also got, we actually got more money from industrial partners in non-dilutive funding than we got from the government. So all these pockets are important. You have to manage all of that. And if ARPA-E gives you the choice between 36 months and 18, then it's better to get your money faster.
Good advice. Well, we're drawing near the end of our session. I wanted to end with giving each of you an opportunity for some concluding remarks in terms of lasting advice for the audience here. Let's start at the end with Keith.
Yeah, I mean, just for starters, I'm really glad to see how many people are in this audience. There's, with ARPA-E spooling up over the last, handful of years, I think it's just great to see the entrepreneurial motivation here and in other places. Being an entrepreneur is really hard, and it's hard to make those pitches. It's hard to have the courage to take the risks to form a business, and I applaud everybody who is trying to be an entrepreneur and make the technology move forward. I think that's just tremendous.
Thanks, Keith. Frank?
Well, I think that's very generous. And being a VC is really, really difficult. I mean, those guys, man, they have trouble. They have not, most of
You can tell Frank's still looking for funding. He's been very complimentary this session.
You just gotta marvel at their ability to stay in a game where they mostly get it wrong. But thank God, every once in a while they hit a home run that pays for everything. And on top of that, they are selling. You think we have trouble selling? They are selling the ultimate commodity. I mean, how do you convince anybody that money is somehow better than money? But they do a great job, and VC funding, if you are the right company, can be a fantastic blessing.
Great, thanks, Frank. Richard?
So you don't learn to ski by reading a book, and you don't learn to be an entrepreneur by doing an MBA. You've got to get out there and try it. And pick yourself up when you fall over and keep going. Make sure you surround yourself with great people and try again, and you can be successful.
Well said. Tom?
Specific to pitching, be really clear. Bring a prototype. It's a long-term relationship. You may swing and miss the first couple times, but you can always go back. And then focus on the minimal product so you can have something for the next round.
Great advice. I'd like to thank our distinguished panelists for their time. So Ray, if you can stand up, and feel free to sign up for coaching after the session. Thank you all for your attending.